And we're back talking about hormones today. So we're going to continue with the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid produces 3 hormones that we're going to be concerned with. We're going to lump those first 2 hormones together, the T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. These are basically hormones that are going to increase your metabolism. So if you remember on the first day when we lectured on endocrine system, we talked about the difference between how protein-based hormones or water-soluble hormones stimulate cells versus how steroid-based or lipid-soluble hormones stimulate cells. In this case, these are hormones that can directly go into the cells and trigger the mitochondria to start producing ATP. So because they can go directly into the cells to stimulate ATP production, these are going to be lipid-soluble hormones, and therefore they have a pretty broad effect within the body. Now, the third hormone that's going to be produced by the thyroid is called CT, or calcitonin. Now, calcitonin is an antagonist to a hormone made by the parathyroid gland called the parathyroid hormone. That's going to be a tough one to remember. Now, these 2 hormones are antagonists of each other. So if you remember what that means, if they're going to be an antagonist to something, they're going to oppose each other. Now, we talked actually about CT and PTH back when we talked about skeletal system and maintaining bone density. So we can take these 2 antagonist hormones, and here's our little parathyroid glands down here, these little 4 dots on the posterior side of the thyroid, and we can create one of these kind of teeter-totter drawings that shows you how calcitonin and PTH impact or counteract each other. So I normally want to maintain pretty regular balanced levels of calcium within the bloodstream. Calcium is very important, if you remember, because it does a variety of things, but some of the things that we've actually talked about in class are that it's going to cause release of neurotransmitters at the synapse. So if a neuron wants to stimulate another cell, it's going to have to release those neurotransmitters. To do that, calcium is going to have to flow into that synaptic knob and cause the synaptic vesicles to release their neurotransmitters through exocytosis. So it's going to cause the release of neurotransmitters. Don't forget, it's also very important for binding to troponin, to pull tropomyosin off the binding sites on actin. And that, of course, is going to trigger the start of a muscle contraction. So calcium is very, very important for muscle contraction. It's very important for neuron communication as well. So I want to make sure that I keep this balanced. If my calcium levels get too high, then my thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. And as we learned from skeletal system, calcitonin calcifies bone, right? So it's going to cause my cells to take that calcium and store it away in bone. If, however, my blood calcium levels get too low, definitely don't want that. So our parathyroid gland is going to release PTH, and PTH is going to cause me to release calcium from that bone tissue. So it's going to break down bone. So a little trouble here. All right, so we're going to summarize this. Calcitonin calcifies bone, so it causes cells to build bone, storing excess calcium. Whereas parathyroid hormone is going to cause cells to break down bone releasing that calcium from the bone. So they're kind of teeter-tottering, working back and forth against each other to make sure that our blood calcium levels stay balanced. All right, so that's our thyroid and our parathyroid. If we move down that, you can kind of see here, here's my thyroid gland right here. I can't see the parathyroid glands from this view because they're on the posterior side of my little butterfly-shaped thyroid. If I move down, you can see there's another gland sitting right on top of the heart, and that's called your thymus. Now, your thymus is very, very important early in childhood and development, starts to atrophy or shrink as you hit puberty and adulthood. It produces some very important hormones called thymosins, which are not in your course pack, so it's worth taking a note of those. So your thymus is going to make thymosins, and thymosins are going to stimulate T cell maturation. Okay? Now what that means is, we haven't talked about immune system yet, but it's going to help T cells mature. T cells are the cells in your immune system that target and attack specific invaders. Okay, so these are not just other white blood cells that can wander around and attack any bacteria or anything like that that are in your body. These are very specific cells. These are kind of your special forces. You have T cells in your body that can attack all of the different types of pathogens that you've been exposed to over your life. So if you've been exposed to chickenpox, either because you contracted chickenpox as a child or had the vaccine as a child, then you have T cells that can target that invader. But you have different T cells for each specific invader. So a T cell that's able to target something like chickenpox or streptococcal bacteria cannot target a different pathogen. So they tend to be very specific. As you age, since that atrophies, then when you're exposed to something new and novel, like we're seeing right now, then your thymus has atrophied, so therefore it's more difficult to train those T cells, and therefore it's more difficult for you to target and attack those new invaders. So it makes it harder to fight off something that's new. All right, so that's your thymus. Sits right on top of the heart right there. All right, if we look at our pancreas then, and we're going to kind of finish this talk off here by talking about your pancreas. Your pancreas has a couple of special functions. It can be both endocrine, meaning it makes hormones. It also can be exocrine, meaning it has other secretions besides hormones that it produces. So its exocrine function is that it's going to produce digestive juices or digestive enzymes that are going to be dumped here into your small intestine. And we'll learn about that more when we get to digestive system. For now, we're going to focus on special cells within the pancreas called pancreatic islet cells, or the islets of Langerhans cells. And these are going to secrete hormones into your body fluids. Now, your pancreas secretes two specific hormones that we've talked about before, insulin and glucagon. Right? We talked a little bit about those last week when we met in class. And if you go back here for just a minute, our little teeter-totter regulation with our antagonist hormones for calcium regulation, we can do the same kind of drawing for blood glucose regulation. So we want to maintain good balance of blood glucose. If our glucose levels get too high, then the pancreas is going to release insulin. Insulin is going to trigger cells to store excess glucose as glycogen, especially in the liver and muscles. Now, it is possible to use that glucose and the energy from that glucose to actually build new lipid molecules and store it away as fat as well. But in this case, if it's a kind of a short-term adjustment, then we're going to just store things away as glycogen. If my glucose levels get too low, then my pancreas is going to release a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon is an antagonist, so that means it's going to do what? right? Obviously, it's going to do the opposite of insulin, so it's going to trigger cells to break down glycogen and release it back into the bloodstream as glucose molecules. So that way we can maintain our blood sugar levels when we need them. Now, we talked before about how there are different types of endocrine disorders. Obviously, you can be hyper and hypo, just about every hormone there is. So you can produce too much or too little of anything. If somebody is hyperglycemic, and this is something that continues for a period of time uncontrolled, then we may say that that person has diabetes. Okay? There are two main types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. Now, type 1, this is our genetic form of diabetes. So this is when somebody is unable to produce insulin or enough insulin to be able to regulate their blood sugar. And type 2 diabetes is generally environmentally induced. So lack of exercise, poor dietary habits, then that can bring on type 2 diabetes if we have weight gain. Now, there are a variety of different arguments about what's happening with type 2 diabetes. I encourage you to do a little bit of research to compare those. One is the idea that if my body gains a significant amount of weight and I now have more tissue that's demanding hormones, I may not actually have enough insulin for the extra body mass. So in some cases, people with type 2 diabetes may respond to insulin. So we can use insulin in those patients to help bring their blood sugar levels back down. However, you can also damage the cells and the body's chemistry and therefore lose receptors for insulin. If I lose receptors, then it doesn't matter if I flood the system with more hormones. It's like throwing massive amounts of mail into the postal service, but nobody has any mailboxes. So if you don't have a mailbox, you can't get your mail, right? So in that case, an individual is not going to respond to insulin injections. And so what's the best way to deal with type 2 diabetes and keep it under control? You guessed it. Those two things that we should always be concerned with anyway: good old-fashioned diet and exercise. All right, that's going to leave us off for today, and we'll come back in a little bit with another video to work on the next couple of glands.